Welcome to the library. My name is Carrie. I'm a member of our adult programming team here, as well as my colleague Jamie in the back. Thank you for coming tonight on behalf of the Friends of the Howell Carnegie District Library to this evening's Friends Cultural Forum. So our forums are generously supported by our Friends bi-monthly book sales. Book sales are typically the first and the third Saturdays of the month from 10 till 3:30 p.m. Our next book sales are going to be May 7th, so coming up, and May 21st. If you are interested in more sales dates or becoming a friend, you can visit our website and see additional details there. A few upcoming events that we have. Tomorrow we have our Scones Bake-Along, which is a virtual event for adults and teens. It's from 6 to 4:40 or 6 to 6:45. This event is virtual. It does require online registration, so make sure you check out our website if you're interested in that one. We have coming up our knit nights, which are the second and the fourth Wednesdays of the month. The next one is May 11th from 6 to 8 p.m. And we also have Michigan's Clean Slate Laws Explained How to Clear Your Criminal Record, which is May 18th from 6 to 7 p.m. So for some more information, additional events, again, go to our website. We've got all of that on there. At this point, I'll ask everybody to silence your phones. The bathrooms are in the back hallway right there. This event will end after the library closes at 7 p.m. So we'll have everybody exit out these doors here at Clinton Street. There are some event evaluations over on that table, so if you could just fill those out and then hand them to myself or Jamie on your way out, that would be wonderful. So with that, this evening we have Drew Lathin. He has been playing around with native plants and built landscapes for nearly 20 years, formerly as the owner of Creating Sustainable Landscapes, now in its 11th year, and is the current owner of Michigan Native Landscape Design. He is a fierce advocate for the need to rewild our urban and suburban landscapes using native plants and thoughtful and legible designs to bring biological diversity and beauty to our everyday lives. 400 of his clients have rain gardens, prairie gardens, pollinator gardens, natural shorelines, and alternative lawns. Drew is the former president of the board of the Wildflower Association of Michigan. And tonight, Drew will be speaking about landscaping with native plants. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Lathin.
Thank you. I forgot to open my water. Good evening. Small, intimate crowd, huh? So, I know you'll be able to hear me without this, but we're doing this for the recording. So, yeah, like Carrie said, I've been playing around with native plants for quite some time, and I intend to make the case why you should do that too. Some other iterations of this talk, or at least one other iteration of this talk, is called "Everything You Learned About Landscaping is Wrong." And I have Exhibit A here from Michigan Gardener, How to Make a Butterfly Garden. It's 2 parts. I counted about 4 things that I would do differently. So, there's this whole big horticulture industrial complex, and I sort of look up hashtag big horticulture. I think they all go to me. So it probably started, big horticulture probably started when we became affluent enough to be able to say, why should I landscape with a roadside weed when I can have an exotic plant from China? And we didn't know any better back then. And so this whole industry has been built in terms of breeders and sellers and Home Depot and your garden center and the skills of people that build and maintain landscapes. But there's a new paradigm that's emerging. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the problem is, With big horticulture, I'm going to talk a little bit about some ecology, because we need to do that to understand why it's essential we landscape with native plants. I'm going to talk about what else am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about how you can start approaching it in terms of the design of your gardens and the maintenance of your gardens. So let's begin. There was an article in, oh, why isn't my presenter mode there? All right. So there was an article in the New York Times back in 2018 that talked about the insect apocalypse and how insect populations are crashing. That was followed up with an article from The Guardian in February of 2019 that talked about, at the current rate we're going, insects are going to disappear within 100 years. You're all old enough, except you guys in the back, to remember driving down a road in the summertime and having your windshield plastered with bugs. Doesn't happen anymore, does it? Not to the extent it used to. There was an article or a study reported in the New York Times that over the last 50 years, we've lost 30% of our birds. And then there was, see if I had my presenter mode, I could tell you which UN agency had this report, but it basically talks about 1 million species of a million species of plants and animals that are threatened across the globe. And so in North America, we see huge declines in our wildlife. And the causes primarily are development in agriculture and the ancillary uses because of that, of pesticides, the loss of native plant species, invasive species, climate change, light pollution. And so when you look at a satellite photo at night of the US, you can see east of the Mississippi River just how much land has been gobbled up. And less so out in the west until you get to the coast, but you know, the east, that's a lot of land. And on this land is a lot of lawn. And there's more lawn being created every day. You live out here, you know, a little farther out beyond the older suburbs, and you see how much forest is being cut down or fields being turned into development and housing and all the lawn. And on that lawn, we throw a lot of crap on it. And much of it, some of it is carcinogenic or suspected to be so. And a lot of gasoline, and of course the associated carbon pollution with that. And if you're hooked up to municipal water, we are using 30% of our municipal water and lawns. Just think about that. It falls out of the sky, goes into the river and the stream and the lake. We pull it out, we clean it to drinking water standards, and we throw it on the ground. West of the Mississippi, that's even greater. It's closer to 70 to 80%. Read an article today that Las Vegas is mandating people take out their lawns. In Las Vegas, they're mandating that people take out their lawns. They have incentives to do that, but if you've been following the worst drought in 1,200 years in the West, the original intake valve for Las Vegas in Lake Mead has been exposed. And so water is no longer going in there. If you ever go out to Lake Mead, go to the Hoover Dam, you know, you just see that bathtub ring. So, and of course, a lot of the land is, or half the Earth's surface is devoted towards food, and we certainly need to eat, But there's smarter ways to do agriculture than the way that we're doing it. And because of ethanol subsidies and crop insurance, the 0.1% of the original grasslands in the United States are being converted at rates to agriculture rates faster than in the last 100 years, and that's because a farmer can farm on unproductive land and know that he or she's going to get paid whether their crop is successful or not. And add to that the introduction of invasive plants. About 1/3 of the vegetation in our natural areas are invasive, and they came here sometimes by accident or food, but most of them are here because of big horticulture, importing plants from other continents that have become invasive here. And so I took this picture, healthy open woodlands there. This is what our woodlands are supposed to look like. You're supposed to be able to see through them. So, here's here's one invasive species, buckthorn, and you just see how dense it is. Nothing can grow underneath it. Here's a picture I took on the left of honeysuckle. This is in the spring, and our spring ephemerals, even though they are in the forest, in the woods, need a lot of light in the spring in order to go through their growth cycle. It's starting to happen now, late this year since it's been a cold April. But they get a lot of light before the trees leaf out and they produce flowers. But not so with honeysuckle there, that leaves out at the same time and blocks the sun going to the light, wiping out the ephemerals. And then, of course, there's garlic mustard. Garlic mustard came as an herb, and it's allelopathic. Puts a chemical into the soil that prevents other plants from germinating. And so it can just march forward and wipe out whatever is along the way. And then I'm sure you've all seen in every roadside ditch and wetland this really tall grass, which is Phragmites, believed to be a Eurasian species. Came in on a boat in the 1700s along the East Coast and has spread through all the waterways across the continent. And so nothing else can grow underneath it. It's just too dense. So in addition to that, a lot of the plants that big horticultures brought to us sometimes come with diseases that they have developed immunity towards or mechanisms to deal with, but our native plants do not, because they did not evolve with those pathogens. So chestnut blight brought in by Japanese chestnut all but wiped out the most abundant tree in the Appalachian chain. Dutch elm disease, you've all heard of Dutch elm disease. Dogwood and anthracnose. This is our native flowering dogwood. I don't know how anybody can conceive of improving upon this beautiful understory small tree, but big horticultures brought us Coosa dogwood, which sometimes has dogwood and anthracnose that our native dogwoods did not evolve with, and so have no immunity to and no defenses. And so dogwood and anthracnose is killing these beautiful trees. And then sudden oak disease that came in on foreign nursery stock. So it's a fungus that gets in a wound of an oak tree, particularly in the red oak family. And if a red oak gets infected by it, it can kill the tree in 2 to 3 weeks, and then spread by roots to adjacent red oaks. So if you have an oak, now is not the time to prune an oak. December, January, and February only, during the cold season when that fungus is not around and being transported by a beetle. So the bottom line is that between 95 and 97% of our original U.S. landmass has been cut, plowed, or paved. You look out the window, there is nothing original out there. Most of the original stuff, not in cities and suburbs. So let me shift gears. That was the problem. Let me talk a little bit about some ecology. Everybody like birds? Yes, of course. So question is, what are birds eating in the spring? What are they eating now? Seeds, anybody? Berries, anyone? No, they're eating insects, particularly caterpillars. The seeds have all dropped, the berries are gone, and so they're eating insects, particularly caterpillars. So this chickadee here will only go 50 yards to get enough caterpillars to feed its clutch. And in those 50 yards, it needs between 350 and 570 caterpillars a day for its nest, all within 50 yards. So do the math, 16 days, that's between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars it needs for a successful clutch. And it has to get those within 50 yards. And like this chickadee, 96% of our terrestrial bird species are feeding their young caterpillars. So those birds, next week you'll be able to sleep with your windows open. So those birds that are going to wake you up at 4:30 in the morning are all out getting caterpillars to feed their young. And it's because caterpillars have a lot of protein. Baby birds are at risk in the nest to hawks, to raccoons, and so they need to grow up fast so they can get out. And so caterpillars are the best. Other bugs will work, but caterpillars are soft and squishy, and whereas a beetle is harder to digest. So mama bird or papa bird can take a beak full of caterpillars and shove it down the throats of the baby birds, and they grow up pretty fast. But in addition to that, lots of things eat insects. Insects make the world go around. Frogs, toads, salamanders, skunks. Your opossum here, cute little animal, eats tons and tons of insects. Even 23% of the diet of a black bear are insects. So lots of things eat insects and depend upon them to survive. So a world without insects is a world without biological diversity. So now you're starting to get why it's a problem to have these population crashes of insects, because it cascades up the food chain. So the next question then is, what do insects eat? And they're eating plants for the most part. Yeah, I know the mosquito's eating you, but for the most part, insects are eating plants. But plants can't get up and run away. 37% of all animal species worldwide are herbivorous insects. And so since they can't get up and run away, they have to develop other defenses. So things like thorns won't protect against insects, will protect against some mammals and things that may eat them, and keep the kids out of your garden if you want. But lignans and grasses and chemical toxins as well. And chemicals are the most common defense that plants have evolved. Things like bitter tastes, toxins, and digestive reducing compounds. So let's, as by way of an example, talk a little bit about monarchs, because they're such a charismatic species. They have this amazing journey that they take in the fall, and then down to Mexico, and they come back. And so there's this relationship between milkweeds and monarchs. So whereas an adult monarch can take nectar from many species of flowers, the caterpillars can only eat milkweeds. They can't eat anything else. They can't eat anything else any more so than you and I can start eating oak leaves. We just can't do it. So that's the only thing that they can eat as caterpillars. And I'm sure many of you have broken off the leaf of a milkweed and seen that white sap. In that sap is a toxin. It's a cardiac glycoside. And so any insect that comes along and eats a milkweed will have its heart stopped. And in fact, if you could get by the taste of it and eat enough milkweed, it'll stop your heart as well. But if that doesn't work, if an insect has developed tolerance or evolved tolerance to the cardiac glycoside, the sap, will gum up the eating parts and either suffocate or prevent an insect from eating. So that sap is very gooey. So when you see this picture of a monarch caterpillar eating this milkweed leaf, what do you not see? You don't see the sap, right? So what it does is it walks out to the petiole here and it snips the vessels that supply the sap to the leaf. Because a monarch caterpillar can have its chewing parts gummed up. That can suffocate it as well. Now the toxin is still in the leaf, but the sap isn't there. So, after it does that, it walks down to the other side of the leaf and happily starts munching away. So I'm sure you've all heard about the decline in monarchs, and it's because of the loss of milkweeds, primarily in the Midwest, in the farming region, where there's just a whole host of milkweeds. And it started when Monsanto, through an ingenious marketing strategy, wanted to sell more Roundup. And so what they did is they developed genetically modified Roundup-resistant corn and soybeans. So whereas a farmer didn't have to till their fields in between the rows to kill the milkweeds, which usually didn't work because the milkweeds would survive tilling, they can now spray their fields with Roundup. And shortly thereafter, we saw milkweed populations crash and we saw monarch populations crash. So depending upon the year, we're down anywhere between 80 and 95% of the monarchs that used to be here, all within a very short period of time since about the turn of the millennium. So the monarch caterpillar can only eat plants from one genus, from milkweeds. And there are 11 species of milkweeds that are native to Michigan, and they can eat any one of those species. But like the monarch, 90% of insects are specialists. So the federally endangered Carner blue butterfly can only eat one species of plant, eastern lupine, Lupinus perennis. There's only one species of lupine native here. And so lupine is a savanna species, and savannas are even more under threat than prairies are. And so due to loss of habitat, it has landed the Carner blue on the federally endangered species list. But you keep going, and the Hebrew as a caterpillar can only eat black gum, the fawn sphinx only ash, the royal walnut moth as a caterpillar can only eat walnuts and hickories, the witch hazel dagger moth only witch hazels, and I can't go on and on, but there are people who can go on and on. You saw I borrowed some of those slides from Doug Tallamy. Has anybody ever read any of Doug Tallamy's books? Must read. He's written 3 books. The Nature of Oaks, Nature's Best Chance, and the first one is called, can't remember now. I suspect you have some of those in the library. Doug Tallamy, Tallamy. He's an entomologist at the University of Delaware. So the question then is, since these plants have toxins in them and various defense mechanisms, when can insects eat specific plant species? And they can do it when they've evolved certain adaptive mechanisms. The first is their ability to find their host plant. If you've ever looked at a female monarch looking to lay her eggs, she will fly around, and bam, land on a milkweed to lay her eggs. She has very good plant ID skills. The second is the ability to synchronize their life cycles with needed parts on the plant. So monarchs are now migrating from Mexico up into the Midwest, but milkweeds have not emerged from the ground here yet. Mostly true. I have some milkweed in my garden that's about this tall. But we don't see any monarchs yet. So they, as a general rule, will not outrun their food source. So as milkweeds emerge from the ground, the monarchs follow that. The third is physical and behavioral adaptations to be able to eat their hosts. So an example of that being the monarch caterpillar snipping the petiole. It's a behavioral adaptation. It has evolved to be able to eat milkweeds. And the fourth are digestive enzymes to detoxify and rid those chemicals. Interestingly, the monarch actually retains the cardiac glycoside, which becomes its defense against things eating it. But for the most part, insects have the enzymes to digest and rid themselves of these toxins. And these evolutionary processes take thousands of years to occur, which means then that for those 90% of insects that are specialists, they can only eat native plants. They can't eat anything else because they've evolved these adaptive mechanisms to be able to eat their host plant. Because remember, 90% of them are specialists. Oh, I said that. So it's usually the leaves that feed the young. So big horticulture has told us butterfly bush is a great plant for butterflies. And true, it will attract a lot of butterflies. But it's from China, and it has chemical toxins in its leaves that allow for exactly 0 species of caterpillars to eat it. So it begs the question, why feed the young when why feed the adults when you're starving the young? So imagine sitting down at the dinner table with your kids or your grandkids, pulling the dinner platter up, shoveling some food onto your plate, and turning to the kids and saying, sorry, you can't eat. Butterfly bush. Now, you'll get no argument from me, it's a beautiful plant. And what big horticulture has done is brainwashed us into thinking about the only thing that matters is what's good for the human eye, not for wildlife. And so insects have not had enough evolutionary time to be able to adapt to the toxins in these leaves. And that can take thousands of years. And butterfly bush is now being understood to be an invasive species. So anybody have a butterfly bush? Dig it out, kill it, kill it. It's a dangerous plant. It's put a native plant in there instead. You know, if it weren't invasive, you know, you could say, you know, I'll plant some natives around it. But we're starting to see that it's starting to spread. So when you look at this oak tree, this white oak that I took a picture of out in a field, you go, wow, what a beauty. And it is a beauty. It's lush, it looks healthy, and it is. But when you get up close to it in July and August and look at the leaves, they're torn, they're tattered, they're chewed, there are holes in them. And this is a good sign because this oak is feeding more than 500 species of Lepidoptera. Oaks feed more species of Lepidoptera, moths and butterflies, as caterpillars, than any other plant species in the eastern United States. So when somebody says, what tree should I plant? The answer is always an oak. So when you don't have native plants, you don't have insects. Here's a list of the usual suspects in our yards. You know, boxwood's very common plant, but it feeds one species of insect. And this is a particularly stupid plant because if you have ever looked at a boxwood at the end of winter on the north or the west side of a building, what does it look like? It's been frozen to death. Its leaves are brown. It's from a zone or two south of us. Well, I mean, it's an Asian species, but it's not a zone 5B plant. Forsythia, they're in flower right now, supports one species of insect. And go out and look at the flowers. You won't even see the bees using it. So it looks great for a couple of weeks, and then it's totally useless. Compare that to a mostly random list of native plants and the number of species of insects supported by them. There's no contest. So Doug Tallamy at his house went out one day in July of 2014 and just at head height counted the number of caterpillars on his oak tree. And people say oak trees grow slowly, right? This tree's 15 years old from an acorn. So, I mean, look at all those caterpillars. Then he went to his neighbor's Bradford pear, which are just starting to bloom right now, and he found one caterpillar. And Bradford pear is a terribly invasive species. Drive down the road in a week to 10 days, and you see all these white-flowered trees along the side of the road. That's what this is. Big horticulture told us they were sterile. That was bullshit. They were either stupid or they lied to us. There is no other explanation. It should be banned. So the bottom line is that native plants produce 4 times the insect biomass, 3 times more insect species, 13 times the caterpillar species, and 35 times more caterpillar biomass. That's 3,500% more caterpillar biomass that is produced by native plants. So we use native plants in our landscapes because of habitat. Plants being the only thing that can convert the energy of the sun into biomass, which then feeds the 90% of insects that can only eat native plants, which then feeds the 96% of terrestrial bird species that need insects, and other animals too that need insects, and then the things that eat the insects. So this heron may not eat insects, but it's very dependent on insects because its food source needs insects. Not only that, our bees are picky eaters as well. Our native bees, of which there are 400 species of native bees in Michigan, are 4 times more likely to take nectar from native plants than non-native plants. It only makes sense. They co-evolved. So shape of the proboscis of the bee, shape of the flower, it makes sense without me getting too graphic about it. In addition to that, 20% of our bees are what's called monoelectric or oligoelectric, which means they'll take nectar or pollen from only a very, very narrow range of plants, sometimes as narrow as 1 species, sometimes to a genus. And so for bees, it's important as well. Forget about honeybees. We hear a lot about honeybees because it's an economic concern. When a beekeeper loses more than 15% of their hives, it becomes a problem for them to make money. But we can always make more honeybees. It's the native bees that are the conservation concern. And although everything we should do to protect honeybees also protects native bees, the problem is that honeybees compete for resources with native bees. And since they live in a very small area, as we saw in the cities in March of 2020, when you pack a lot of living things close together, disease travels really fast between them. And so a honeybee visiting a flower where a native bee is, 80% of our native bees are solitary. They transmit diseases as well. So in addition to that, native plants can tolerate the sub-zero temperatures we inevitably get, the inevitable summer heat and drought, and survive being eaten by insects. And they can do it without any supplemental water or fertilizer or spraying. Just think about it. What did these plants do before the Europeans came? They did just fine all by themselves. And they can do that because of their root systems. Here is turf grass, and it's 4-inch deep root system. So many of these native perennials have root systems that are 3, 5, 7, 10, and in some cases 15 feet deep. And so they can suck a lot of water out of the ground. And when it's hot and droughty out, they don't even know it's dry because they're able to get water from deep within the ground. So here's a picture of my front yard. I don't have much grass, but you can see how the grass has turned brown. My irrigation system hasn't worked in 8 years, and I have no intention to fix it. But you can see how, with a 4-inch deep root system, it turns brown. But look how lush the beds are because of their root systems. So the advantages of using native plants is, hopefully I've made the point about the habitat that it can create from native plant to insect and up the food chain. You can eliminate things like potable water and herbicides and fertilizers and all the chemicals. You'll have lower water and sewer bills. You won't have any chemical bills. And of course, it's healthier. It's healthier for wildlife, you, your kids, your grandkids, your pets. It's just a much healthier place to live. But yet, we still landscape like this. Here's Bradford pears. You go to Home Depot or your independent garden center, ask them where their native plant section is. Usually the person will go, huh? And they don't, because they're selling these horticultural weeds. So we still landscape like this. So I live in Novi right now. I took this picture of this development. Anybody here ever been to Novi? Yes, your quintessential sterile, soulless suburb. And so, you look at this. It's like, good European fashion. Clear out. I'm moving in. So, there are none of the layers. You go out into the wild. There's a canopy layer. There's a shrub layer. There's an herbaceous layer. There's none of that there. There's no life there. One day I'm driving along Pontiac Trail, and there's wild oak meadows on Wild Oak Lane with a big burr oak out in front. What? Wild oak meadows, cool. So I go in, and it is neither. Here is the intersection in Novi of Acorn Trail and Overlook Trail, post-apocalyptic. There is not a tree there that produces an acorn, and the overlook is into a mowed detention basin. Northridge Woods. Here's Heritage Woods. So, you ever notice that new developments are named after what they destroyed? So, I think developers have hired the firm George Orwell and Associates to help them come up with names for these new developments. So we have landscapes without nature. Excuse me. We've been taught that the only good insect is a dead insect. We've been taught that when you see an insect in your yard, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to kill it, right? We're taught to select plants that are pest-free, which is code for plants from other continents with chemical defenses that don't allow anything to eat them. And so we live in landscapes with few insects, and that's the problem. So again, plants, the only thing that can convert the energy of the sun into biomass, which feeds 90% of the insects and 96% of the birds, and up the food chain. And when we don't eliminate native plants and don't landscape with natives, we're wiping out the insects, And the birds? Remember, bird populations are down 30% in the last 50 years. And that data's a little old, and I'm sure it's not any better. And so on up the food chain. So let's now shift gears and talk a little bit about the way out. All right? So there is a new landscape paradigm that's emerging. And it starts with the understanding that nature is no longer something that's out there and is going to take care of itself, and I can do whatever I want here in our built landscapes. Because remember, earlier in the program, I talked about the declines in North America of lots of species of animals. So that means the front lines for the battle of nature are now in our front yards, our backyards, our library landscapes, our industrial parks, right-of-ways, ditches, schools. And so we become now the ecological warriors of the future. And the beauty of this is you can do it in a totally apolitical way. So, if you wanted to be, for the environment, and you wanted to get involved, what outlets did you have? The Sierra Club, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and various other organizations with certain political bents, which may or may not align with your politics. So I have clients that range all the way from the left to all the way on the right. And the common thing that they share is an appreciation for nature and an understanding that they can do something at home to be able to support wildlife. So we become the ecological warriors of the future, and so our plantings cannot be just for the human eye anymore. They need to be able to clean our stormwater, provide for pollinators, provide for biodiversity. So a 2012 study by the US Department of Agriculture shows that there are 103 million acres of residential land. So, quick quiz. All of our national parks, more or less than 103 million acres? Less. So we have more residential land in the United States than all the national parks put together. So Doug Tallamy's talked about the homegrown national park. So in the past, we chose plants basically for decorative value for the human eye. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that. I work very hard to make sure my clients have something that's really good eye candy. But we also need to support the food webs and all of those other things as well, and balance that. And there really is no compromise in doing that, although the designs look different. So let me talk some about native landscaping principles, and I'm going to talk about design, and I'm going to talk about management. So the first principle in design is to match plants to the conditions in which they evolved. So you look at the soil type, whether it's sand, loam, or clay, whether it's wet or dry, sun or shade, and you come up with a combination of those, and you pick your plant. Pick your plants. So, we always had all combinations of those, and plants inhabited every one of those niches of all of those. So here's a picture I took of butterfly weed. You can see it's a short plant by nature of the swallowtail on it. Look how crappy that soil is. If you read a garden magazine, or if you read Michigan Gardener, How to Make a Butterfly Garden, they're going to tell you to put compost in the soil. So if you tried to plant butterfly weed and put compost in the soil, you're going to kill that plant from overeating. This plant evolved in sand prairies. And so the reason why it can survive there is because it has a 10-foot deep taproot to be able to get. So, you read a magazine, you hire a landscaper, they look at the soil, and they're going to say, oh, you need to amend the soil. So all that does is transfer money from your pocket to their pocket. I can give you a list of 30 species of sand prairie plants that will thrive in soil like this. Now, whereas this plant will do great here, it won't stand a chance here, or vice versa. And we have had the opportunity to plant in standing water. Not me. You know, it's one of the 20-somethings working for me. You know, which one of you is going in the water to plant this? And depending on how hot the day is, you know, you see this or you see this. But there are plants that evolved in standing water as well. This is my backyard pond. It looks about that like that now. That's Marsh Marigold, which likes wet, mucky soil. If I move this plant back a foot, it'll die. It needs to be wet all the time. I'm sorry? Marsh Marigold. Marsh Marigold. Caltha palustris. So that picture was taken standing over here looking at this edge of my pond there. This is later in the season. But there's standing water in here all the time, 365 days a year. But look how happy those plants are. Because I'm using wetland species that like to have wet feet or even be in standing water. Blue flag iris will live in 4 inches of standing water. That's a river birch. That's cardinal flower. Yeah, I don't like the term black-eyed Susan because there are like 4 species that can be called black-eyed Susan. That's Rudbeckia fulgida. And here's brown fox sedge. There's some blue lobelia and red twig dogwood over here in very wet soils. So when you match plants to the conditions in which they evolved, you don't need to amend the soil. You don't need to change the drainage patterns because if you have a wet area, you're going to use wetland plants. And so it's just easier. A second principle is to plant in masses and drifts. I took this picture at the Kresge Foundation in Troy, at the corner of Big Beaver and something else. These are all native plants. And so traditional horticulture, plant mulch, and you'd see a lot of space in between plants. Makes you wonder, do they hate plants? So with natives, since they're not bred and they grew out and evolved out in the wild, they need the support of each other around them so that taller plants won't just fall over. You take something like this penstemon back here and you put one in the ground, it's this tall, just one with nothing around it, it's just going to fall over. So it needs to have plants around it. So we plant them densely in masses and drifts. And this doesn't look unkept or weedy because they're putting them in drifts. You got the baptisia here, little blue stem, penstemon, switchgrass back here, and mirrored on the other side. So it's legible, planned, and beautiful, and productive. Here's from a client that we planted, a mass of ferns, a mass of prairie dropseed over here as well. And then a little earlier in the season, picture taken from up here is prairie smoke, which is about ready to flower now. But it isn't plant mulch. They're just all packed in together. And when you do that, you don't need to mulch. Now, we put down a layer of mulch to start with because there is some space between plants, but when they grow up, they grow together. And so after that initial layer of mulch, it never gets mulched again because the plants are providing competition against weeds. That's not to say you're going to do no weeding, but your weeding will be vastly reduced if you pack them in tight. So you read plant spacing recommendations, plant them 3 feet apart. No, plant them 12 inches apart. Pack them in tight. Here's another drift of pickerel weed here and a drift of prairie drop seed here, tightly together. And the other thing about this is this pickerel weed is actually planted in standing water. And this prairie drop seed is high and dry. So, demonstrating right plant, right place, and packing them in tight in masses. Here's a drift of Retibita, side of my house, a drift of wild bergamot and purple coneflower. Both those plants co-evolved together. I guess that's redundant. Co-evolved in the North American prairie. So I can put them right next to each other and they won't fight. They get along. They play well together. So when you plant masses and drifts, it's easier for an insect to find its host plant. So instead of having to just try to find one plant, there may be 20 of them. And so an insect will find its host. It's much easier, more efficient for its foraging, more cross-pollination, makes the landscape legible. Usually people go to the store and they have a little bit of space and they'll buy one of 7 things, one each of 7 things. And if you're planting in masses and drifts, if you only have room for 7 plants, just get 7 of one species and put it in there. If you have room for 15 plants, get 7 of one and 8 of another. And so when you do that, it's legible because you can see, I got something here and I got something here, not 7 different things all scattered together. It allows for the elimination of mulch, less weeding, texture, and then you have you've built these communities of plants that evolve together. Another principle is the layer vegetation. You've seen this before: overstory, shrub layer, herbaceous layer. So remember I said earlier that more than 500 species of Lepidoptera use oak trees as its host plant, but of those more than 500 species, 94% of them pupate in the ground or leaf litter. So it's not good enough to plant an oak tree in lawn because those 94% that drop out of the tree are going to get mowed. So instead, put beds underneath the trees so that when the caterpillars drop out of the trees, they're not getting mowed and they have a place to hide and to continue their development. So the benefits of layering is it mimics the natural settings so that things can move up and down from canopy layer to shrub layer to ground layer. Another principle is limit lawn only to areas that need it. And areas that need it are play space for kids to kick a soccer ball around, pathways for boundaries, for a buffer, and entertainment spillover area. There's my neighborhood. You can probably figure out which one is my house. How many of you now or when you had kids kicked a ball around in the front yard? A little bit, okay. Because you didn't have a backyard, or? A lot of people don't. How many of you entertain in your front yard? Get out of here. Most people don't. And so none of my neighbors do. I never see my neighbors. They never come outside. I don't get it. From the house into the garage, into the car, out, car into the garage, into the house. Their kids don't play outside. But anyway, my kids are off the payroll. And so I don't need to have lawn in front. So there's a rain garden, perennial bed. I have a little more lawn in the back because if we entertain, we need a little more space than the patio provides. There's my pond. But I have much less lawn than my neighbors. There's my neighbor's front yard. There's my front yard. But I got pathways. I have grass as a buffer here. And pathways there. There's another pathway, goes around that way, goes around that way. This was a client, new house in Rochester. Didn't want to have lawn. The only lawn we actually did were just pathways of grass. Another principle is provide continuous succession of flowering across the growing season. One, for the human eye, people like to see color across the whole growing season, and it's good for pollinators too, so that they can collect nectar and pollen throughout the season. And it adds some a dynamic nature to it. So, you know, you get some color here for a while. You know, if you pair it with planting in masses and drifts, you get some color here for a while. Then you get some color over there. Then you get some color over there, and it moves around. Here's a lawn extension we did in Northville a number of years ago. This is a May picture with hairy beard tongue. Next picture is from the same vantage point. This is a July picture with the butterfly weed. And there's the September picture with the black-eyed Susan. May, July, September. So, but there are really only 3 flowering species in there. I mean, that's a lot of space. It'd be tempting to put 20 different things in there. Keep it simple. Here's another client. You could see the mass of butterfly weed there and yarrow here. And then just a month and a half later, there's Retibita and purple coneflower. And so, you know, it looks different every few weeks. Another principle is formal in front and wild in the back. It'll help with the anxiety of your neighbors. So this is my front yard. And I'd call this formal because it's masses and drifts. You know, I got the border here, you know, right now the butterfly weed is flowering. There's rattlesnake master and prairie dock. But that's in back of my house, done by seed, just totally intermixed. Here's the front yard of a client in Bloomfield Hills. We told the planning board there when we asked, can we not do lawn? Because they have an ordinance that requires lawn in front. I said, can we do short prairie grass? We'll just do a short prairie grass in the front. They said yes. That is a short prairie grass as opposed to a tall prairie grass. But very formal. You know, it's just one thing there. But this is the back. Another principle is use cues to demonstrate intentionality. So things like a sign, pathways and rocks, cairns in my front yard, sculpture, walls, hedges, and fences. Things that will.
Is that your sculpture?
I'm sorry. Yeah, that's mine. Somebody gave it to me. It's right next to my pond. It's a heron. He said, "You need this."
Yeah, that's like out of an old.
It's made out of all kinds of stuff. There's rebar. All right, so let's talk about management, or sometimes referred to as maintenance. So when you plant in dense drifts and masses and you layer, you have far less weeding, no more additional mulch. If you put the right plant in the right place, no supplemental water, which makes it easier and cheaper. And then you just edit to preserve legibility. Edit's another word for weeding. So when this block of plants, seed drops over here, you edit it, you pull it out. Another principle is to leave the leaves. We're taught to rake up the leaves and get rid of them, right? But in those leaves are the eggs of caterpillars, the eggs of butterflies, the caterpillars, and in some instances like this comma, an adult. So some butterflies overwinter in leaf litter as adults. And so rake your leaves and throw them away, and you're throwing away a bunch of wildlife. You've spent all summer trying to nurture these things, and you don't want to kill them in the fall. There's a Luna moth cocoon in leaf litter, and that's what a Luna moth looks like. Go out into the forest. Nobody's raking the forest, despite the fact we had a president once who thought we should be raking forests. But you know, those spring ephemerals are coming. I just leave them there. Any plant that can't come up through 4 inches of leaf litter probably doesn't deserve to live anyway. So, but nobody's raking the forest, and those plants are doing just fine. So yeah, just leave them there. We're also taught to cut down plants in the fall. Clean it up, put your beds to rest. Again, in the stems, a lot of things are hunkered down for the winter. Cut them down and throw them away. And that wildlife, those insects you tried to support in the summer and nourished in the summer, you're getting rid of. And if you leave the seed heads up, then birds are going to come and eat them. And then when you do cut in the spring after it's been warm for a while, which means about now. But only cut to about knee height, because in those hollow stems, solitary bees are going to go lay their eggs. So there's your free bee house for a solitary bee. And then when you cut, mulch in place. Just drop it. Don't rake it up. It's free mulch. And the plants will grow up around it soon enough and hide that. And of course, never any pesticides, no watering, fertilizing motion. And then, I don't quite know where to put this, but bird migration season is March through May and September through November. And they migrate at night by the stars. And if we're shining lights up into the sky, we are confusing them, and they're banging into buildings, and they're getting lost. So the best thing is to turn your lights out at night. Outside lights. But I understand the security concern of that. So put them on motion detectors. And so I think that's even more secure. So somebody's sneaking up to your house. When that light comes on, it's like, oh shit. And they're out of there really, really fast, as opposed to the light's on all the time and they can figure out a way to get around that. So put your lights on motion detectors. So here's some pictures and videos of the wildlife that's shown up in my 1/4 acre in the middle of Novi amongst everybody else who's doing everything they possibly can to kill every living thing around me with fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides and bad practices. So there's a bumblebee on wild bergamot. There's another one on swamp milkweed, and there's a milkweed beetle down there. And on echinacea. That is bottle gentian in my front yard rain garden. It's a closed flower, and only our native bumblebees are strong enough to be able to open that. So this is going on every sunny September afternoon. Gulp. How cool is that? Bottle gentian. Gentian. Botanical names Gentiana and Drusei. There is my New England aster in October. Look at all the bees on it. This is beekeeping, not building an artificial structure to house bees. And so I've already done my honeybee rant, so I'm not going to do it again. Now, there are some honeybees there, but there are many species of bees there. And while I was there, that guy showed up. That's a yellow sulfur. I'm not the greatest videographer, but you get the point. And there's a great black wasp on swamp milkweed. This thing is docile. It's a solitary wasp. I pet them. I'm serious. You can pet them. They won't sting you. They'll defend their home, but they won't defend their food. And there's a milkweed beetle right there. And because I have a pond, I'm raising dragonflies. And there's a clear-wing hummingbird moth on swamp milkweed. So I have all these things because I'm not using any pesticides, and I have the host plants for these things. And I don't cut them down in the winter. There is a spicebush swallowtail caterpillar on the left eating spicebush. Spicebush is a shade shrub for medium to wet soil. So this is on the north side of my house, gets 5 to 8 feet tall. And there it is on the right. And of course, I have monarchs, because I have plenty of milkweeds. And then monarchs in September love liatris. So they're fueling up for their long journey to Mexico. And that's why things like liatris and asters and goldenrods are very important, because they need those nectar sources to power their way home. And there are other things that eat milkweeds: tussock moth, caterpillar, milkweed beetles. I don't know what that guy is on my spice bush, or that guy on my wild bergamot. There's a cicada on little blue stem. And because I have a pond, the American toads have just shown up. And there's a boy toad making a lot of noise, looking for a woman. And when he does that, you get toad porn. And when that happens, you get babies. Green frogs showed up as well, just showed up. Water is great. And they're reproducing in there as well. There's a hummingbird on cardinal flower, my front yard. In August and September, you don't have to sit there and wait for this to happen like a wildlife photographer. You just walk to your car, and they're there. I've had hummingbirds just come up, from the flowers and go, like just checking me out. Mourning dove, had a great blue heron show up. Goldfinches, robin taking a bath, Nashville warbler, which I didn't know had a caterpillar in its mouth until I blew the picture up. Mr. and Mrs. Duck. They've been coming since 2016, and they're here this year. Now, I think it's the same pair. This might sound racist, but they all look alike to me. But I don't know, maybe they're the same or not. There's a robin eating the berries of red twig dogwood. When I had goldfish in my pond, which I subsequently got rid of because they were eating the frog and toad eggs, had a female belted kingfisher come and grab a goldfish out of the pond. I was sitting at my office window, and I heard a splash, and I saw this bird fly out from underneath the water. And so 1, I was there, 2, I heard it, 3, the camera was sitting right there, and 4, the bird posed. This is my winter bird feeder, dark-eyed juncos. You can see all the seeds on the snow. Free bird feeder. And hawks, so prey on songbirds. So my wife and I will sit on the back patio, drink a beer, smoke a joint or whatever, and watch the hawks hunt. One time there was one in a tree there and one in a tree there, and that one dove into the prairie in the back, and the other one followed in behind it. I didn't know they hunted in packs. And then you see the vegetation go like this. And I have brush piles. This is another thing to consider. Place for birds to hide in a storm, and who knows what other vermin lives in there. Like possums. Possums are great animals. They eat thousands of ticks a year. And so they're very beneficial to human health. They're the only North American marsupial, and they're cuter than all get out. There's a raccoon coming for a drink. And then, of course, coyotes. So I'm regularly picking up coyote poop in my yard. I'll hear things going on at night out there. I think it's got mange. Mm-hmm. But I've seen other healthy coyotes, just haven't had the camera on me at that moment. So if insects were to disappear, most of our flowering plants would go extinct, food webs would collapse, and humanity would be doomed. So how can you start? I highly recommend ripping out everything and starting all over again with natives. But it's time-consuming, it's expensive, it's a lot of work. So back up a little bit. Take out a little bit of lawn every year. Put in a rain garden or a perennial bed, or flip a perennial bed. Just say, I'm going to take all these non-natives out of this perennial bed this year and put in natives. And then at the other end of the spectrum is anytime something dies, replace it with a native plant. But in terms of best bang for your buck, go after your invasive plants first. So one of Doug Tallamy's graduate students did a study in DC and found that compared to native landscapes, yards dominated by introduced plants produce 75% fewer caterpillars, 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees, with fewer eggs, less likely to survive, fewer fledglings, and delayed maturation. Delayed maturation should be up higher because that's one of the reasons why there are fewer fledglings. So there's this Native American proverb that says that the land isn't ours. It's our children's land, and we're just borrowing it from them. And I'm sure all of you have borrowed a tool from a neighbor, a ladder or a hammer or a saw, or borrowed a blender or something. And if it needed some oil or needed some fixing or needed a screw tightened in it, I'm sure you did that before you returned it to your neighbor, before you returned this borrowed tool to your neighbor. And so what I'm suggesting is we think about returning our land to our children in just a little bit better condition than when we found it. And it's an easy thing to do. There are a lot of things we can do. Recycle more, get an electric car and all that. Some of those things are cheap, some of them are not so. But an easy thing to do is to start using native plants. So, any more questions? Yeah, so the question is there a list or a website? Yeah, I got a list. It's 400 species long. It's a spreadsheet that's 400 species long and about 30 columns wide. But an easy way is to just just go to a nursery's website, like go to Wild Types or New Leaf Natives, and living here, you're pretty close to Wild Type. They're in Mason, and they have public sale days in May, although you have to schedule an appointment. But look at their online catalog, and just make sure you follow, the moisture requirements, the sun requirements. A website that I like a lot, though, is Prairie Nursery. They're in Westfield, Wisconsin, because they also put in soil type. So wet, sun, and clay calls for a different palette of species than wet, sun, and sand. So I like that website. Other questions? So go to the website of Creating Sustainable Landscapes. Creating. Yeah, that was my old company, and I must have been stoned when I came up with the name, because it's a verb and not a noun. When brainwaves just don't travel the same way in an altered mental state. So I created creatingsustainablelandscapes.com. So there's a page there that has resources. Other questions? Virginia waterleaf. Clay wet shade. That's pretty common here. Depends how wet. I mean, Virginia waterleaf, wild geranium, woodland phlox. Almost all our soils here are alkaline. So if you get a plant from a local native nursery, they're probably adapted to alkaline soils. You go to other parts of the country, they have the same species, many of the same species, but they're in acidic soils. And so I wouldn't take a plant from another ecoregion, even though it's the same species, and bring it here. Like cardinal flower is native from northern Florida into Minnesota. But if you took the seeds of each of them and did that, neither of them will survive. Other questions? How do you do it? You put it in the ground. That's how it happens. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Better to grab an acorn. Much higher survivability, because you're disturbing the roots. And then cage it so that the deer don't eat it. Yeah. Cage it until the bottom leaves are this high. That'll prevent rabbits, but I'm talking like chicken wire. But I gotta do it pretty good size around it. Yeah, because right. We need to be shooting more deer because we've eliminated their predators. We've eliminated their predators, and I hope I don't offend anybody, but people who are adamantly opposed to deer culls are are acting based upon Disney and not science.
Yeah, the deer aren't doing that well.
Right. You know, the only predator they have has a blue oval in the front of it. And so, you know, they're just getting hit by cars. But, you know, we don't need, you know, we've eliminated the wolves. We only have the occasional cougar that moves through. So they don't have any natural predators. The coyotes won't take care of them. So you got to cage it. Other questions? Great. Thanks for coming.